So, happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy spring equinox. Really, I've come to think that the celebration of the Irish of this feast, usually falling within Lent, during which the Lenten austerity would be put on hold and a feast of riotous revelry would take place, with parades in the streets, with giant floats, giant marionettes roaming the streets, monsters out of myth and legend, many St. Patricks carrying their staffs, their mitre, the crozier staff with the top like an unfurled fern, chasing dragons and snakes. It often struck me that this is very much a spring festival. These are the rites of spring, and Patrick is the one who chases off the dragons of winter, and the flood of drink cleanses us, purifies us, and enlivens us for the spring to come, often coming in that dry, arid stretch of Lenten abstinence. Of course, St. Patrick didn't really drive out snakes, and contrary to what some modern pagans would have us believe, the snake was not either a symbol of paganism, particularly in this case. I mean, we could read it symbolically, that St. Patrick was the one who evangelized the Irish. Thus, the old serpent, the serpent power of the monoliths and the mounds, is driven away or driven underground again. Quite possibly. However, as we previously learned, there were no snakes in Ireland, because Ireland was cut off from mainland Europe by the waters of the Irish Sea when the glaciers receded after the last ice age. And, the snakes never made it, and they couldn't really get on boats, fly or swim. And so Ireland has always been snake-free, pretty much. There are a couple of small lizards, and even, I think, a slow worm, which I think is a legless lizard. So it's hard to say whether we'd call that a serpent or not, but basically there are no snakes in Ireland. But there are dragons, there are sea worms of all sorts in our legends, and perhaps Patrick could be seen as having put to fight those. Now, what's the story of St. Patrick? I mean, who was this man? Did he exist? It certainly seems that he is a real person, and we know him mainly from two texts, his Confessio, his confession, and a later text which was a letter written to a Roman dignitary. And in school we learned that the year of Patrick's arrival in Ireland in the 5th century was the very easy to remember 432. So I remember it. Tradition has it that was the year. Of course, it's not actually that sure, and it's possible that Patrick arrived just sometime in the later part of the 5th century. He says at one point that the Franks were still pagan when he wrote one of his texts, and we know that the Franks' incursion into France was in 451, and in the 490s they were baptized en masse. So that places him comfortably sometime in the second half of the 5th century for a lot of his activities. Now, who was he? Well, in fact, Patrick was a Roman Briton. He was perhaps of mixed descent, but he came from a Roman family, the family of Calpurnius, and I believe he lived in Wales. And his name, Patricus, perhaps associates him with patrician class. However, he was, as a young man, kidnapped by Irish slavers. And this is an interesting thing to know, that the Irish Gaels kept slaves and raided to take slaves on the coasts of Wales. So he was taken as a slave, and the legend has it, and his own self-hagiography has it, that he was put to tend sheep on a hillside, and he was a shepherd, and at one point, a starry night, the stars arranged themselves into a vision of God's angels. I think I've got that right. Anyway, in a dream, he was shown his route to escape, and he escaped on a ship from Ireland and fled back to Britain. But he had another dream in which a figure came to him bearing the voice of the Irish, and they cried out to him for succor. They said, "Come, save us." Now Patrick was resistant. He resisted this call to adventure first. He said he was not worthy and he was lacking in education. So it took him a while to learn enough to come back. When he did, he arrived in Ireland, maybe around 432, to the pagan Irish, and he became one of the most incredible evangelists that we have known. He was a diplomat. He went to kings and gave them gifts, to lawmakers, petty kings. He gave them gifts but would accept none in return. He made magical bells cast in bronze and coated in iron. No, cast in iron and coated in bronze, that were said to convert those that were within earshot of him. He left other magical items. He performed magical contests against the Druids and won. The Druids' magic could not defeat him. He converted kings, and so their whole tua, their whole kingdom would convert along with him. And he challenged the Druids at the bonfire of Ishnich, at the Umbilicus, the centre of Ireland in Meath, the 5th central cuaige or county, province. Patrick travelled all over Ireland. He performed miracles, even by his own account. He raised people from the dead. Perhaps, yes, metaphorically, we could see his defeat of the Druids as the defeat of the serpent power of earth. He's also well known for his parable of the shamrock. It's another probably apocryphal story, but apparently someone asked him, but how is this that there could be 3 persons in one God? Now, that strikes me as odd, considering the tendency for the pagan Gaels to have triple gods, and particularly triple goddesses. For example, the 3 breeds, or the goddesses of the Marigna. They were well used to the idea of 3 gods in one. And indeed, one might argue that many of the features of the patrician Celtic Christian church were actually borrowed and copied from a Druidic Celto-pagan worldview, including this triad. But isn't it funny how the triple spiral, the triskele, became, in a sense, the shamrock. The 3 circles joined. And apparently he held up this 3-leafed clover, the shamrock, and showed it to them, and he said, "You see, from the one leaf, 3 leaves. From the one stalk, 3 leaves. From the one God, 3 beings, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit." And of course, in Celtic Christianity and in Irish Catholicism today, the 3 beings of God, in a sense, are more like Father, the Son, and the Mother, because the cult of the goddess, the Marian cult, is so strong. I've been talking to friends recently about this, about how Irish Catholicism, and indeed many other forms of Catholicism, are really halfway towards what we call paganism, because they include this aspect of goddess worship. They include the aspect of soft polytheism, the many saints who are called upon to intercede, and much folk magic. In fact, the Mass itself is an act of magic. And it's no surprise to me, for example, that Patrick when he went up against the Druids, would be seen as a magician, because the early Christian priest saints, pilgrim saints, evangelist saints, they were also magicians. And when they held bread and wine and told the people, I am transforming these into the body and blood of our God, this was an act of deep magic. And many other things. I think at one point he struck the Liafoil, the stone of destiny, that is the heartstone of Ireland, with his staff. He caused it to cry out. I have to look up that one again though. He definitely struck a stone with a staff, which, you know, has an interesting sort of Freudian ring to it as well. But Patrick was a pretty cool saint. The way he wrote about himself in his Confessio, he is a soul-searching, humble, holy, philosophical, but quite simple man, burning with the power of his faith and the power of his doubt.
And as such, he is Patrick Iverson.